Cool. Thank you, everyone. And as you've heard already, my name is Miya St John and I'm a speech pathologist and a PhD candidate based at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and I'm really delighted to speak to you all today about speech and language more generally and then more specifically in relation to NF1. And I'd like to also give a special shout out to my supervisor, and who's an amazing speech pathologist researcher, Professor Angela Morgan, who's guided me a lot on this work. That one? Thanks. So, as an overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'll be giving a brief introduction into speech and language more generally, and then looking into the speech disorder subtypes. I'll be talking about what we know already about speech in NF1, a little bit about the current research project that we've been working on at the Murdoch, about the methods of this study and some of the preliminary results of the study, and then I'll finish with a summary and some clinical recommendations. So, as many of you know and are aware, it's often mentioned that individuals with NF1 may have communication challenges or speech delays, although it might appear sufficient to just say individuals have speech delays or communication delays. It doesn't really provide a speech pathologist with enough nuance to understand the best therapy options and strategies required. So you have to be more specific than this to be clinically helpful. I suppose how I would describe it would be if you're talking about a particular type of tumour, you need to know what that type of tumour is before you can treat that tumour, and it's the same with a speech disorder. You need to know what the specific speech disorder is before you can treat it appropriately. And so very simplistically, we can divide communication generally into two distinct areas, and those are speech and language. Speech being the perception and production of speech sounds, while language is more about the understanding and use of words and grammar to communicate meaning. So put simply, if a child can't say, or if they don't say a particular word, is it because they can't produce the sounds or the string of sounds in that word? So that would be a speech problem. Or is it because they don't have the concept of that word in their vocabulary, so they don't understand what that word means? And that would be an issue with language. And so if I presented this picture to an individual and I said, what is this? So giving a really basic example of the distinction between speech versus language. If the child said, that's a wabbit, well, they've got the language, they understand the vocabulary, they understand that they're looking at a rabbit, but they can't quite put those sounds together clearly, so that would be a speech difficulty. If the child looked at that picture and they said, that's a cat, but they said cat clearly, well then they don't have a speech issue because they can say the word cat, but it's more an issue with language, so the vocabulary, they're not understanding what that specific thing is. So that's a very basic example of the distinction between speech and language. And then within these categories, you can have a number of different and distinct disorders. So under the umbrella of speech, you might have difficulty with articulation, with something we refer to as phonology. You might have a motor speech disorder, and under the category of a motor speech disorder, we have something called childhood apraxia of speech, dysarthria, and then stuttering. And then on the flip side, if you're looking at language, you could have difficulties, or an individual could have difficulties with their receptive language. So that's what they understand is being said to them, or what they understand when they're reading language. Or you might have difficulty with expressive language, which is what they say, what they're able to communicate, both written or verbally. You could then also have difficulties with social language, which sort of blurs the borders a bit and comes under language, but then comes under a number of other areas as well, but we sort of pop it in that category. So now I'm going to focus a little bit more specifically on speech, because this is the focus of the research in this project that I've been working on. And so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on speech now. And it's really important to understand the distinctions between the different speech disorders, because they're not only distinct in how they present, so how an individual sounds, but also how common they are, how you would go about treating those disorders, and also how easily you can treat those disorders. So first we have articulation and phonology. So articulation and phonological issues for the most part are more common than motor speech disorders, and they're more easily treatable. And I'm speaking quite generally, but for the most part. Articulation errors refer to the difficulty in making sounds and forming particular speech sounds properly. And the most common example that people would think of is a lisp, so having a difficulty with one particular sound across everything that you say. And usually a child with an articulation problem will have difficulty producing one or two particular sounds. And sometimes these can be structural. So if a child has something to do with their jaw or their tongue or their teeth, this could impact their ability to produce these speech sounds clearly or particular speech sounds clearly. Phonology, on the other hand, or a phonological disorder, or phonological errors, refer to error patterns. So a child has the ability to make the sound in isolation, but they tend to make particular errors in a patterned way. And so we have a number of different patterns that we refer to in speech therapy. One example is gliding, so that would be when a child says wabbit for rabbit, or wed wabbit for red rabbit, or something like a weak syllable deletion. So every time they have a multisyllabic word, they're leaving off the weak syllable in the word. So you might hear a child saying nana for banana, or mato for tomato. And these are quite common, and you hear children doing this typically in typical development. Now moving on to the motor speech disorders, and there are 3, and each of these disorders are very distinct in the etiology, but can have overlapping clinical manifestations. So what you hear might be quite similar. Childhood apraxia of speech is a very rare condition, affects maybe 1 in 1,000 kids in the typical population, and that's due to a difficulty in motor planning and programming. So children know what they want to say, but they have difficulty producing and sequencing the sounds together accurately and with the right stress patterns for clear speech. And we refer to childhood apraxia of speech as CAS commonly. You might also hear dyspraxia or verbal dyspraxia. They're all interchangeable terms for the same thing. And CAS is characterised by a number of features, and it can make children really highly unintelligible, meaning they're very difficult to understand. And it's also much more difficult to treat in comparison to the articulation and phonological issues that I talked about first, and sometimes can be quite difficult to diagnose because there's not a lot of clinicians that are really specialised in understanding CAS. Dysarthria is another speech sound disorder. It's also very rare, and it's caused by a difficulty in neuromuscular execution, and that's characterised by quite slow, slurred or effortful speech, and often people would think about dysarthria as being common in something like cerebral palsy, so that's an example of dysarthric speech. And then finally, our last motor speech disorder is stuttering, which many people are familiar with, and that's a difficulty in speech fluency and the flow of speech, and that's characterised by the repetition of sounds, syllables or words, prolongations of sounds, and interruptions in speech, which we refer to as blocks. And I'll just emphasise again that really knowing these distinctions, or your speech pathologist knowing these distinctions, is really important, because the treatments and the strategies and the approaches that you'll be using will be different. And unpacking that in NF1's been the focus of the research that we're doing at the moment. So, in terms of NF1, what do we know about speech in NF1 already? So we know that roughly across the research, about 25 to 48% of past research has referred to mild articulation errors. But the problem with a lot of this past research is it hasn't looked across speech more generally, it's just focused on articulation. And oftentimes papers aren't delineating between whether it is actually articulation or is it phonological? Because they can both sometimes sound very similar to a listener, but that doesn't mean that you would treat them the same. And so phonological delays and disorders, there's limited evidence. Some patterns have been referred to, but not really systematically assessed in research. In terms of motor speech disorders, stuttering has been mentioned in the research previously, but more referring to general disfluencies that aren't quite considered stuttering. So people observe that individuals with NF1 have some sort of speech disfluency, but can't quite categorise it in the same way that you would a typical person who stutters. And then Apraxia and Dysarthria, there's really not much research looking into either of those areas, but some research has sort of touched on the features of those without classifying it as one or the other. And so because no studies have really comprehensively profiled the speech and in children and adolescents, and also in adults, but I'm focused mainly on children in my work, because this hasn't really been comprehensively profiled, there's a real gap in the literature, and that's why we started this project, or my supervisors started this project, knowing that there was a real need for detailed speech profiling and a differential diagnosis of speech disorders in NF1. So the current project that we have been working on, the aims of this current project, are to understand the prevalence of speech disorders in children with NF1, to distinguish and to differentially diagnose which specific speech disorders are most common in NF1. Is it articulation? Is it phonology? Or are there motor speech features as well? The methods of the current study, we included individuals who met the diagnostic criteria for NF1. They had to be aged between 18 months and 15 years, that they had not taken a stimulant medication in the 24 hours prior to assessment, and this was really just from a research perspective, being able to control the variables in the project, and that they had to be English speaking. Once again, our assessments are all in English, and our therapists that are in our team all speak English, so from a research perspective, that's why we had that limitation, or have that limitation. Our exclusion criteria were that individuals could not have been diagnosed with any symptomatic intracranial, so any brain pathologies, such as epilepsy and acquired brain injury. These conditions in and of themselves would affect speech and language, and so it's important to know which features are affected, or what's the profile of NF1 without these additional complications. So individuals in the current research project, and I'll just say this is still ongoing, so all the data I'm talking about today is all preliminary. We're getting close to the end of the project, but and we've got some great numbers in the project, but it's still ongoing. So when we do publish the work, it'll be hopefully a little bit bigger, a little bit broader in terms of the results. But individuals underwent testing in person, either at the Royal Children's Hospital or with collaborators at the Children's Hospital in Westmead, or some individuals have undergone telehealth assessments as well. The assessments, our speech assessments, were undertaken as part of a wider neuropsychological testing battery. So I think Hayley's going to talk a little bit more about that more generally, and we just make up this small little speech portion within that much larger battery of research. And so the two speech assessments that most participants completed were a test called the Goldman Fristo test of articulation. It says articulation, but it doesn't just tell you about articulation, it tells you about multiple other speech disorders. That's a single word test, so individuals are presented with a picture and they have to label the picture that they see, and that tells us about their single word speech production. And then individuals participated in just a 5-minute conversational speech sample with the clinician that was doing the assessment. And that really just tells us about, because single word tests can be very different to how someone actually sounds when they're having a conversation, that tells us about how that individual sounds in their everyday life when they're having a conversation with their friends or their family or other adults. And we used these two assessments to assess for what were the articulation errors, what were the phonological patterns, and what were the motor speech features. Now on to some of the results of the research so far. So the demographics of the group, we have 78 participants that have participated in this research so far. They're aged from 3 years up to 15 years, with a mean age of about 7 years, 9 months. We have a perfect 50-50 split of males and females just by chance at the moment. Individuals, 56% of them had spontaneous NF1 and 44% had familial NF1. And participants had a range of comorbidities. So some individuals had autism, some had ADHD, additional language impairments, motor issues, etc. Lots of other different things going on for individuals who were in this study. In terms of the speech results overall, so based on this assessment that we did and on the pure scores, we found that 70% of the individuals that had participated would be classified with a speech disorder based on the results of this assessment alone, but the majority of them had mild errors. So they were quite easy to understand. Generally, individuals could communicate with them and they were intelligible, so able to be understood and were clear, but did have a speech, what would be classified as a speech disorder based on this assessment. In terms of the standard scores, across the group as a whole, the mean score was 70.6. So what does that mean? For this assessment, scores between 85 and 115 indicate the range of typical, what we would see as typical in this assessment. And so kids were about 1 standard deviation below what we would see in the typical population, which I think mirrors what somebody said about IQ scores as well. You know, a little bit below what we would see in the normal range. When we split the group a few different ways, we didn't see any differences with males versus females in terms of sex. So males generally performed the same as females with NF1. And we didn't see any differences with those who were sporadic NF1 versus familial NF1. So they performed roughly the same. Although in terms of statistics, it's quite a small sample size, but we didn't see any trends either way. Of this 70% who had a speech disorder, individuals presented with both articulation and phonological disorders. And in many cases, they had both. So even though I was talking about all those individual speech disorders before and how they're treated differently, many individuals in the typical population as well rarely have just one in isolation. You may have more than one. And that's what we saw for the NF1 group. So of this 70, we found that 54% had mild articulation errors, so errors on specific speech sounds. And the most common sounds that individuals had difficulty with were the first little symbol, that's our little speech pathology symbol, the circle with a line in it is for the sound, so the sound at the start of think. The second bubble is the ch sound, so the sound at the start of cheese, for example, and the z sound, for example, in zipper. Those were the most commonly affected individual sounds, but there was a range of other sound errors as well by smaller numbers of individuals. And then in terms of phonology, individuals presented with both typical phonological processes or typical errors and atypical errors. And what that means is when we refer to a typical phonological process, that's something that we see in typical development. You hear kids saying things like lello, simplifying sounds in different patterns. That happens in typical development, but many kids outgrow this. And so if a child's still making these errors beyond the time that we would expect them to have resolved, we refer to that as a typical process. And there were a range of typical processes that we saw. And then we also saw atypical processes, and these are error patterns that we don't see in typical development. And so an example of that is backing. So when a child is, when a sound should be made at the front of the mouth, instead it's made at the back of the mouth. So instead of saying dog, they might say gog, and we don't see that in typical development. And you would use different therapy approaches for trying to address typical processes versus atypical processes. now onto the motor speech features. So this is not important to take that in, that chart, and it's really just more interesting from a research perspective. But I kept it in the slides just to show that the majority presented with many different motor speech features. So, for example, the orange wedge is showing features of voice quality or phonation, and these were the most common. So individuals had things like a breathy voice, so 84% of the group presented with a breathy voice. 74% presented with what we classify as a hoarse voice, for example, so they were in that orange voice quality wedge of the circle. And then there were also some difficulties with resonance, so that's the difference between your oral and nasal cavities, and if you have difficulty producing oral versus nasal sounds. And so a hyponasal presentation was something we saw very commonly, and that might sound like someone just has a bit of a cold because they're not allowing as much air pressure out their nose as they should when you're speaking. We also saw imprecise consonants across many individuals, but again, all of these features that we saw, almost entirely in 100% of the individuals, were mild. So we noted small features here and there, but they were almost subclinical, so meaning you wouldn't necessarily need to do something about them. It didn't really affect their intelligibility, but it was just something that we observed about their motor speech production. And then lastly, this graph represents an area that we're still assessing and we're looking further into. But what it's showing is that average speech scores across the different subgroupings of NF1 so we divided the group according to different comorbidities. So in the first two columns, you can see those with a lower IQ score also tended to have a lower speech score. In the middle two bars, we're looking at autism. So there were those in the autism group versus those without autism. And in general, those without autism also had better speech scores. And then again, we split the group into the language impaired group versus the typical language group. And those in the language impaired group also tended to have more impaired speech scores overall. And the fact really that many areas of speech, language, and just general cognition are intimately linked. It means that these results aren't necessarily surprising, but it's an area we're continuing to look at in the research and to see which areas have a relationship. So, in summary of what I've talked about so far, approximately 70% of our group had a speech difficulty, although largely it was mild. Speech difficulties presented as articulation errors in roughly 50%. Phonological errors were more common than we originally thought, or that's been reported in the literature, and that common motor speech features included voice changes and changes in resonance or nasality changes as well. And so what does this mean in terms of clinical implications and for your child and their speech? Some questions that you might want to think about asking once you get into the speech pathology service, and you might want to make sure that your speech therapist would be accurately addressing, is asking questions like, are they assessing both speech and language? And which is impacting your individual child more? I didn't focus on language so much in this talk because the focus of this research has more been about speech. But it's definitely an important distinction, and we know that there are some language impairments that can come with NF1 as well. And it's definitely an area of the research that's being looked into at the moment amongst our group and other groups. Other questions you might want to ask are whether they're, if you are looking at speech, are they looking at articulation versus phonology? Have they assessed for the difference between the two, and are they accurately using evidence-based therapies for those particular conditions? And And this is really important because the type of speech disorder will impact the treatment, but also the research tells us that across the board with individuals, phonological disorders are more likely to be linked with ongoing problems with later language and later literacy. And so therefore it's really important that your therapist is targeting the right thing. It's no point doing an articulation therapy for a phonological disorder because it won't make a difference, because that's not what they're treating. And that can be relatively common, that people make that mistake in the speech therapy industry, although I like to think that most people don't. And it depends where you live and the training of your therapist and you know, many, many factors. So asking those questions, don't feel afraid to ask your therapist, what's the evidence for the therapy that you're using? Because that's your right to ask that question. And my last sort of point is to ask or to think about is how their speech disorder is impacting their intelligibility. So for mild speech errors, that might not be much of an issue, and it might be more of a language that you might want to be targeting in speech therapy. How's their language and their speech affecting their social relationships? Or how is their language or their speech affecting other aspects of their life? And so those questions are really going to determine what area you focus on in your therapy. And finally, I'd just like to give some acknowledgements, because I don't do this work alone and I rely very much on a large team. So the Speech and Language Group at the Murdoch Research Institute and my supervisor, Professor Angela Morgan. The Brain and Mind Group, also at MCRI, so Associate Professor Jonathan Payne, Dr. Christina Haybeck and Dr. Hayley Dark, and the rest of the team. The Westmead Children's Hospital, of course, the CTF, and then most importantly, all the research participants and their families for participating in the research. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Miya. Is there anybody in the room who has questions? I know there were a couple with speech therapy questions earlier. If not, do we have any online? Sorry, just looking at our online questionnaire. No, I think we're good. Any questions? No questions in the room. Oh, one at the back, yeah.
Sorry. What is the difference between sort of that type of speech therapist? My son currently sees a speech therapist for feeding, and we haven't sort of seen anybody from the Royal Children's Hospital as yet, but that's a different thing. My question is, can we ask those questions to the same speech therapist, or we need to get a different speech therapist?
That's a really good question. So I did not touch on feeding at all, but it's an area of speech. It is an area of speech pathology, and in general, therapists would undergo some additional training to be specialists in feeding. But across the board, your speech therapist should know about speech versus language and all the things that I covered, even if they're a feeding specialist. So yes, you can ask those questions to them, and if they feel that they're not the best person to answer your questions based on speech or language or other areas, then they'll be able to refer you on to the most appropriate therapist. And that's great that you're linked in with a feeding therapist, because that's not something that I touched on and not part of our research at this point, but is obviously a very important part of speech therapy. And oftentimes feeding will be addressed before you address things like speech and language, because it's impacting your child much more so from a medical and health perspective. I hope that answers that question.
We've got one that came through online. There seems to be plenty of research on our speech and cognitive issues, and sadly no service is able to us to address them. How can we as parents step in?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question that I don't really know how to answer. And I guess I'm coming from a research perspective, and from what I've seen, there's actually quite limited research into speech and language in NF1, and there could be more research into NF1 and probably NF2 as well, but I'm not sure. And so I suppose we're hoping that doing these sorts of research projects to say, actually, this is important for this community. Speech and language are impacted in this community will hopefully help to provide further funding and services down the track. So I guess if you're a parent and you've been offered to be part of a research project, we would love you to get involved, but then, that's also up to the individual, and that can be quite burdensome as well to be involved in
And
research.
also depending on where they're located as well.
Also, yes. Yeah.
There's also one more. Have there been any identified increased occurrence of links with CAS and NF1 compared to the general population?
Yeah, so that's something we're still looking at in this project. So that big donut that you saw with all the potential motor speech features, some of those features are associated with CAS. Whether that is associated, because you can have features that overlap between CAS and Dysarthria and also stuttering as well, we don't know whether, is it just an individual feature and really doesn't... it's not actually a CAS diagnosis. We just don't know the answer to that question. CAS is a really messy diagnosis and can be quite complex to make that diagnosis. There might be some links and there might be a slightly higher prevalence in NF1 of CAS, but we're not sure yet.
Okay, I think that was it for coming through. We'll have a short break now. We'll make it sort of a 10-minute break. We have some coffee and things outside. For those at home, we should be back, what time is it? In about 10 minutes. Thanks.